Voting is widely considered a right, but it's also considered a duty in some countries. Australia is one of them, and one of a small number to actively enforce the requirement to vote in its elections. It's been that way for over 100 years, and Australians have largely accepted it as part of the nation's culture, but is it the foundation of our democratic system, or an outdated tradition out of step with the modern world? The Commonwealth Electoral Act 1918 describes doing one's bit for democracy as the duty of every elector. This was not the case for the first 9 federal elections after Federation, however, when an uncharacteristically lax policy permitted Australians to suit themselves when it came to their civic responsibilities. This freedom entered in 1924, when a senator from Perth introduced a private parliamentary members' bill to mandate voting, described as being of a revolutionary character in Hansard debate records. This followed the 1922 federal election, when voter turnout fell to 60%. It also came after the precedent set 9 years earlier in Queensland, when the Sunshine State became the only place in the British Empire at the time to oblige electoral participation. The passage of the bill into law was expedited with little debate and no formal opposition, and, perhaps predictably, voter turnout surged to over 90% at the 1925 election. It has remained at similar levels since. A review of parliamentary debate records from 1924 reveals that the proposed law excited more controversy than is generally supposed. Transcripts of its second reading in Parliament help to explain the motivation behind it, largely based on concern for the democratic legitimacy of elected representatives who receive less than 50% of the popular vote. Excerpts from the debate are included in the full article on our website. The justification for compulsory voting rests upon several key arguments. Legitimacy. The strength of a representative system relies on a strong connection between the government and the people they represent. A government has a better claim to legitimacy when more voters have their say. This connection is primarily established by voter participation in elections. All votes cast are made in favour of the system, and each registers consent for it to provide a suitable government. If enough citizens chose not to vote, it would diminish the idea that the overall electorate is represented by politicians who seek to address, or are at least aware, of their concerns and issues. Participation rates. Election outcomes better represent the will of the people when voter participation rates are high. A referendum on a change to Australia's constitution is an example of where participation rates are considered especially important, and such a change is, by law, justified only by a double majority, that is, a national majority and a majority of states. It warrants the attention and participation of the entire electorate. Voting as a civic duty. Article 29 of the United Nations Human Rights Declaration recognises that everyone has duties to the community, but can any right also be an obligation? The idea is used to justify a range of civic obligations, including taxation and jury duty, as well as the requirement to vote. Attitudes towards such duties do change over time, however. One no longer enforced in Australia is national military service, which was required of 20-year-old men from 1965 until 1972. The prevailing view is that some civic obligations, even those that some find objectionable, may be imposed if they are not regarded as too burdensome, or if Parliament believes them to be important to democracy. Public support. The level of public support for compulsory voting in Australia is generally established by citing opinion polls. One source of such data is the Australian Election Study, coordinated by the Australian National University. In results released as part of its 2022 report on long-term trends in political opinion, 69% of voters supported compulsory voting, consistent with prior election years. 77% of respondents would have voted if voting was voluntary. Resources and funding. Political parties and independent candidates in Australia are publicly funded based on election results. If they receive more than 4% of first preference votes, they are entitled to an automatic lump sum and a rate per first preference vote. This was $3 for the 2025 federal election. It is argued that compulsory voting allows political parties to be more efficient with their resources, as they can focus on creating policies rather than encouraging voters to participate, though resources must also be allocated to enforce compliance with the law. Using these arguments, and others taken from prominent advocates for both positions, Possible cases for and against compulsory voting might be made as follows. A case 4. Compulsory voting forces the major political parties to consider the views of the total electorate, all of whom are required to participate. This means that the major parties must provide moderate, centrist policies that appeal to the reasonable people who comprise the majority of the electorate. A system that must provide accessible voting methods for the whole electorate is also more inclusive of minority or disadvantaged voters. Without compulsory voting, disengaged voters would likely abandon politics completely, but as they are required to vote, new candidates are motivated to enter the race and provide better alternatives for them. The requirement to vote once every 3 years is at most a minor inconvenience, though is of great benefit to the democratic system by helping to establish the legitimacy of election results. Those who vote have had their say and are therefore less likely to dispute or be seriously dissatisfied with the result. Representative polls and surveys consistently demonstrate popular support for compulsory voting at around 70% of the electorate. This shows that Australians have accepted it as part of a culture that helps to maintain a healthy democratic system. No convincing case has been made against compulsory voting, and no significant opposition was formed to its implementation. The idea of voluntary voting is very much a minority position. A case against. Voluntary voting would do no harm and only benefit Australians. No citizen would lose the right to vote, and those who wish to vote can still do so, while others would gain the right not to. Citizens who believe there are no suitable candidates who represent their views can avoid supporting those with whom they disagree, including through public funding. Those not engaged with the electoral system will have their indifference or dissatisfaction recognised by their absence, rather than helping to provide legitimacy for its outcomes. Unengaged voters are more likely to be uninformed, and the omission of their votes would mean that the election results better reflect informed opinion. Compelled participation creates only the appearance of engagement and conceals any lack of engagement. Polls may not tell the true story of support for compulsory voting. Only voluntary voting would provide a true view of voter sentiment, a referendum on the practice. If the polls are accurate, participation would remain high. The global democratic consensus is for voluntary voting. Allowing citizens to abstain from voting has not been shown to weaken or destabilise electoral processes in the United Kingdom and United States, where comparable systems exist. Nor does voluntary participation seem to be a factor in creating any deficiencies that may be attributed to their respective systems. There has been no significant public demand in favour of compulsory voting in countries without it, and the long-term trend is decidedly against it. Neither voluntary nor compulsory voting inherently helps or harms one political cause or party. If it does inadvertently, this is not an argument in its favour. The relative strength of Australia's democracy has, historically, rested upon the electorate's faith in the electoral system's integrity, the high degree of trust between its citizens, including its representatives, the perception of a political system that broadly operates responsibly and responsively, and the nation's history of economic opportunity and political stability. These factors have existed independently of the requirement to vote, which has to date been accepted in good faith as part of a culture that values fairness and honesty by a people willing to work together for the common good. Which case do you find more convincing? Penalties. The penalty for not voting at first glance seems quite mild, with a cash payment of $20 enough to satisfy the Australian Electoral Commission. The fine is even waived if you provide a valid and sufficient reason for failing to vote. But those who elect to provide neither can end up in court or even jail. According to the Joint Standing Committee on Electoral Matters report, revenue from fines for the 2013 election was $2.1 million, though the cost to pursue non-voters was $3.4 million. Between 3,000 and 3,500 people were taken to court for the offence in that year. Several submissions argued that the current penalties are not high enough to deter non-voting, though 57% of respondents to a survey cited in the report believed that there should be no penalty or that it should be reduced. Australians have long been known as an easygoing lot ready to accept the status quo. We are amenable to authority, sticklers for rules, and generally don't mind being told what to do. Some have even accused us of apathy when it comes to politics. Regardless, compulsory voting is a fact of life, with most Australians inclined to say c'est la vie to their civic obligation.